However, again, in my interpretation of this, uh, biomechanics essentially correlates to your primary lifts, your intensive and extensive plyos, you know, the bread and butter of the of S&C, we'll say. Whereas the biotensegrity can be adopted and applied as all of the constituent parts that coordinate those movements or those expressions. So if I need to get stronger and I'm force deficient, we're going to spend more time on the biomechanical side. Whereas if we have sufficient force, but we have difficulty expressing or coordinating that, I'm going to go more towards that biotensegrity column. And those, whether or not there are differing technical definitions on those ends, the training applications that I associate to each vastly different with certainty.
Yeah, for sure. And they should be, right? Like, I mean, our definitions sound a little different, but they're not that far off, man. They're pretty close, right? And so exactly what you said about how are you applying those? Like that's where the magic of them happen. It's what when are you using one, when are you using the other, and when are you using both?
Right.
And
And
how do you
yeah, go ahead.
I just how do you create an environment where that can be fluid?
Yeah. I guess another kind of tangent off of that is I believe that if we maintain these same definitions here, 90% of, we'll say, decent strength and conditioning coaches are reasonably proficient on base level biomechanics. I would then at the same time say 90% of those same coaching demographics don't even know what the term biotensegrity means. And to me, that's a little bit of a problem because even if, again, for no other reason than just changing the paradigm or changing the perspective on movement, I do think it's important to see that it just goes further than forces and levers. It absolutely does. And we can use both ends of evidence to make that assertion. Person who has a very clear ACL MOI goes down and then pops right back up, no problem. Person B is a 500-pound squatter walking downstairs, misses a step, and blows their whole shit out. So why in either case do those occur? Because purely off of the math, the biomechanical math, you can't really explain either. So we know the neurology is a factor. We know that the force
Mm-hmm.
timing and kinetic sequencing is a factor. But I also believe that the distribution of force excursions, or in other words, how we are able to lateralize force, is a major influence or contributor to this exact situation. Would that make sense to you?
Yeah, I mean completely. Like um I mean if you look at integrity in its base form, right, you're just looking at a bunch of triangles. It's a mesh. Um so if you could take like a climbing net is a good example. I know they're squares, but we're gonna pretend they're triangles. Um if I start grabbing and squeezing that net, I can deform it a little bit. Doesn't break. Like you can put a lot of pressure into those things. You can pull them apart. You can put people on them, jump up and down on them, and they're bending. They're creating waves. They're deforming and creating all this different movement, right? But they're not breaking. And like to your point, that the force capacity or the force rating on that net probably it doesn't make sense, right? Especially when you apply that concept to the body. So now I've torn tissue, but how? Because I just like I know it can deform and move. And so there's probably some kind of dysfunction, is my thought, within that that structure, that integrity structure, that's causing that. So whether it's not being transduced correctly through the structure, or whether it's just not expressed in a mature fashion. That's another possibility, right?
Yeah, yeah. Well,
So
the skill or the aptitude is of course going to be there as well. But before I lose my train of thought on it, um, combatives is another really good illustration of this, right? Because, and I can even use the SEAL group, the guys that I worked with at BHP, right? Vast majority of those guys I would outlift if we went and did a split squat or a clean or this or that, right? Every single one of them would have me tied in a pretzel in under a minute if we were in a cage fight. So if we are defining and measuring strength as singular expressions on specific lifts, it is no different than the SAT. The SAT does not tell you you're intelligent. It tells you you prepared and you did good on that test. The back squat, all of them, boom, you improved your strength on those things. Now, when we take it out to something like like the cage, right, or the mat, that definition of strength has been completely changed, and it's about the different access points and the different leverage and the ability to read and respond, as we've mentioned, and being able to pre-tense and pre-relax and all these different factors. That all to me is speaking not only to the fascial concepts of training, but the biotensegrity applications of movement. Because like you said, the operative word is with biotensegrity is resisting deformation of the system or of the structure. So if I am doing a single leg RDL and I'm having trouble with stability, and I lock my opposite fist and then lock my scapula down and extend my arm, there's a good chance that the balance will improve because there is improved segmental stability through tensegrity, right?
Right.
The other apt word with biotensegrity is efficiency. It's the efficiency of force and of movement and of expression, right?
Yeah. So one thing you mentioned, like tensegrity being the kind of a resistor of deformation. One of the big powers that you actually just described is the acceptance of deformation, right?
Okay.
You just retensioned to create stability, which you're deforming the system. Whether that's the norm, I don't know, but you're actually the that model allows you to create deformity, right, to induce stability. Whereas the biomechanical model would, I wouldn't say be the opposite, but it's I need to be stable so I can move.
I would say it's more
And
narrowed in interpretation,
yes, that's fair.
right?
And then going back to your combatives, right? That the power there is you can shapeshift. You're sure you're
Shape shift.
using some of the concepts of biomechanics with the levers, but by doing that like shape shifting or retensioning, you're actually allowing some expression through a tensegrity model to come out. And like you
Oh
see
yeah,
it in throwing, you see it in running, you see it in
yes,
uh I think soccer players do it the best, man. They look like gazelles when they jog. They
yeah,
just do. I don't know what it is, but they do.
yeah.
And it's cool, right? Uh but to y'all's point, like how do you know when to induce that in training? Because
I
that's getting into that gray area of like, man, what do I do?
I think my answer to that would be it's a little bit of a cop out, but a little less of the same thing and a little more of other things. And that kind of facilitates another one of my just overarching principles, for training anybody, but specifically athletes is, improving the ability to tolerate variability is the ultimate empirical definition of sport. It's not being the fastest, the highest jumper, the strongest. It's can you create a successful outcome with this unpredictable chaos around you in a very, very quick amount of time. That is the person that tends to win each and every battle. And I think that the variability piece, again, is something that is constrained by contemporary biomechanical and S&C principles, right? We are so myopic to overload, and we're trying to overload shit that doesn't even really matter. It's bizarre to me, but we have this stranglehold on people that, you know, in order to demonstrate that you're doing your job correctly, they need to be 20 pounds heavier, more, you know, improve physique, and then do better on their VBT deadlift. Like, and I've been there, man. Like, so, you know, I get it. But my point is the term, or the way that I define the improving variability concept, is the same roundabout way of saying that robustness is the ultimate quality. It's, you know, we don't necessarily need to make everyone bigger, faster, stronger. We need to probably make just about everyone more resilient to whatever the stresses that they're going to be encountering or subjected to.
Yeah, that's an interesting approach, and you can actually, I mean, in my mind, you can apply them to both, right? You can apply it, you can utilize biomechanics to induce that application, right? Whether it be through a squat or whatever you may use, and you can also use it through somewhat of a tensegrity model, right? To elicit the same thing. Um, even through biomechanics model, if you weren't trying to induce strength changes, you can actually still induce some of exactly what you're talking about, right? How can I respond well to unanticipated stresses? Like, you can create that environment through a biomechanical model. I mean, you talked about it earlier, right? When you used both. So you're doing a single leg RDL. Well, that's kind of a classic biomechanics model, right? I'm
It is.
adding, yeah, I'm adding levers, right? Through some kind of force that's generating a torque around a joint, right? That's in a biomechanics world, that's what's happening. But whether people realize it or not, you tell somebody like, "Oh, your hip's hiking. You gotta stabilize it." That's tensegrity.
Right.
You're kind of using both.
No, and I think it is important to be very clear in saying that, you know, just as Matt and I have discussed about the definitions and differences between fascia and muscle, the same applies here, that the two are inextricable. There's no way to purely isolate one or the other. And I think that's the whole emphasis
Yep.
behind this discussion, is, you know, showing that it's not necessarily wrong. In my mind, it's just an incomplete application or science that is vastly misconstructed or misunderstood. And that if we can have not just a more clarified definition, but also understand the context or the applications to those, you know, counterpart, or you know, somewhat opposing definitions, then we can come back around to unifying it. Then we can say, okay, because here's the difference.
Yeah.
The perfect example was the single leg RDL. The biomechanical model tells you to program the single leg RDL with a barbell, start at 60%, do it for 10 reps, and then over the course of 8 weeks, you're going to work down to 2 reps, and it's going to be done with 80 pounds more than you started with on that first week. I think that is a complete phase one for foundational athletes. So in other words, like 14 to 18. By the time we hit that point of college, I don't, different for everybody. Definitely some college athletes that need to get stronger. But you get what I'm saying. It hits a
Yeah.
certain point where that return on investment, or that, you know, window of adaptation is so small. We're going to waste 6 weeks doing the same exercise so that I can say I went from 195 to 205. And then I'm going to say that that has a measurable difference or meaningful outcome. No, the difference is I start with a barbell single leg RDL with my shoe off. Then I work to an offset loaded barbell RDL. Then I work to a band resisted one. Then I go back to kettlebells, but I have one that's an 80 and one that's a 40. And now, is it purely biomechanical? No, not in my mind.
Right.